In the sweltering heat of South Carolina in the year 1854, a drunken bet between wealthy plantation owners would set in motion a chain of events so extraordinary, so shocking, and so unexpected that it would shake the foundations of Southern society and expose the cruel hypocrisies of an entire system built on human suffering. This is the true story of James Robert Caldwell, a third-generation plantation owner who believed himself untouchable, and Bessie Mee Johnson, an enslaved woman whose brilliance, courage, and strategic genius would bring down an empire and expose secrets that the most powerful men in the South had tried desperately to hide. What began as a cruel joke would end in scandal, death, federal investigation, and the complete destruction of one of the wealthiest families in South Carolina. This is a story of revenge, justice, and the indomitable human spirit. To understand how everything unraveled, we must first understand the world of James Caldwell. Born in 1819 to one of South Carolina's oldest and wealthiest families, James was raised in absolute luxury and privilege. His grandfather had built the Caldwell fortune through rice cultivation and slave labor, amassing over 5,000 acres of prime coastal land. His father expanded the empire, investing in cotton, tobacco, and the internal slave trade. By the time James inherited control of Riverside Manor in 1845, the Caldwell family owned over 200 enslaved people across 3 separate plantations, making them one of the most powerful families in the entire state. James Caldwell was everything you would expect from a man raised in such privilege and surrounded by such cruelty. Tall, handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, impeccably dressed, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He had been educated at the finest schools, traveled to Europe twice, and spoke fluent French. But beneath the veneer of sophistication lay a man of breathtaking cruelty and arrogance. Overseers who worked for Caldwell would later testify that he took personal pleasure in administering punishments, that he deliberately separated families for his own amusement, and that he kept meticulous records of every person he owned as if they were nothing more than livestock in his inventory. But James had one significant problem that gnawed at him constantly and made him the subject of endless mockery among his peers. At 35 years old, he remained unmarried and without an heir. In the rigid social hierarchy of the antebellum South, this was both unusual and problematic. His family fortune required a legitimate heir to continue the Caldwell legacy. His mother, Catherine Caldwell, pressured him relentlessly to marry, parading eligible young women from respectable families before him at every opportunity. But James proved impossibly particular and difficult to please. Some women were too plain, others too talkative, some too educated, others not refined enough. The truth that no one dared speak aloud was that James enjoyed his bachelor lifestyle too much, his absolute freedom to do as he pleased without answering to a wife or her family. The neighboring plantation owners mocked him mercilessly at their weekly gatherings, suggesting that perhaps James preferred the company of his male friends, or that perhaps he was incapable of satisfying a woman, or that perhaps he was simply too arrogant to share his life with another human being. These insults, delivered with smiles and laughter over expensive whiskey and imported cigars, cut deeper than James ever admitted. He was a man obsessed with his reputation, with how others perceived him, and the constant jokes about his unmarried status became an unbearable source of shame. Among the men who gathered regularly at these plantation dinners was Colonel Marcus Pemberton, owner of the neighboring Oakwood plantation, and a man whose cruelty and arrogance nearly matched Caldwell's own. Pemberton was a gambler by nature, a man who bet on everything from horse races to cockfights to which of his enslaved workers could pick the most cotton in a single day. He saw the world as one giant game where he held all the advantages, and he delighted in making bets that humiliated others while enriching himself. On the evening of August 15, 1854, Pemberton hosted one of his lavish dinner parties. 20 of the wealthiest plantation owners in the region gathered at Oakwood Plantation for an evening of excess that would have fed every enslaved person in the county for a month. The men consumed imported French wine, aged whiskey from Kentucky, roasted meats, exotic fruits, and delicacies shipped from Charleston and beyond. As the evening wore on and the alcohol flowed freely, the conversation turned, as it always did, to mockery of James Caldwell's unmarried status. Pemberton, drunk and emboldened by the laughter of the other men, decided to push things further than ever before. He stood up, swaying slightly, and pointed his finger at Caldwell. He announced to the room that James was so impossibly proud, so ridiculously particular, so absurdly arrogant that he would never marry anyone, not even if someone offered him a fortune to do so. The other men roared with laughter, slapping the table and raising their glasses. But Pemberton was not finished. He staggered toward the window that overlooked the kitchen building, where enslaved workers were cleaning up from the dinner service, and he pointed toward a large figure moving between the buildings. That figure was Bessie Me Johnson, and Marcus Pemberton was about to make the biggest mistake of his life. He turned back to the assembled men and made his proposition. He bet James Caldwell $20,000, an absolutely astronomical sum equivalent to hundreds of thousands in today's money, that Caldwell did not have the courage, the audacity, or the sheer boldness to marry Bessie Me, the cook slave, and remain married to her for 1 full year. The room exploded in laughter and shouting. Several men immediately pledged their own side bets. The sum grew to nearly $30,000 as other plantation owners added their wagers. James Caldwell sat in stunned silence for a long moment. The rational part of his brain understood that this was a trap, a humiliation designed to destroy his reputation regardless of what he chose. If he refused the bet, he would forever be known as a coward who backed down from a challenge. If he accepted and went through with it, he would become a laughingstock who had married an enslaved woman for money. But there was another part of James Caldwell, the part shaped by a lifetime of arrogance and the absolute certainty that he could manipulate any situation to his advantage, that saw an opportunity. $30,000 was $30,000, and what did it matter who he married if he could control every aspect of the arrangement? In his mind, Bessie Me would be grateful for the elevation, obedient to his commands, and easily discarded after the year concluded. He would take the money, endure some temporary mockery, and emerge richer than before. James Caldwell stood up, extended his hand to Marcus Pemberton, and accepted the bet. The men drew up a contract right there, outlining the terms. Caldwell would legally marry Bessie Me Johnson within 1 week. They would remain married and living in the same house for 1 full year. If Caldwell fulfilled these terms, he would receive $30,000 from the collective pot. If he failed to complete the year, he would forfeit his entire year's cotton crop to be divided among the men. Everyone signed. The deal was sealed. Now we must turn our attention to Bessie Me Johnson, because everything that happened next depended entirely on who she really was beneath the role she was forced to play. Bessie Me had been born in 1824 on a smaller plantation in Georgia. Her mother had been a house slave, her father a field worker who was sold away when Bessie was only 3 years old. At age 15, after the death of her first enslaver, Bessie was sold at auction to James Caldwell's father, who was expanding his kitchen staff at Riverside Manor. She was purchased for her size and strength, with the assumption that a large woman could handle the physical demands of cooking for a large household. But what made Bessie Me truly extraordinary was not her size or her strength, or even her exceptional cooking skills that had made her famous throughout the county. What made Bessie Me extraordinary was her mind. Through a series of circumstances that she would later describe as miraculous, Bessie had learned to read and write. The wife of an overseer, a northern woman named Margaret Davies who had married a southern man and immediately regretted it, had taken pity on young Bessie. In secret, over the course of 2 years before Margaret died of yellow fever, she taught Bessie not just to read basic words but to read and write with genuine skill. She taught her arithmetic, geography, and even basic bookkeeping. Bessie Mee hid this knowledge as if her life depended on it, because it did. In South Carolina in 1854, it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. Discovery could mean severe punishment or death, so Bessie played her role perfectly. She spoke in the dialect expected of her, kept her eyes downcast in the presence of white people, and appeared to be nothing more than an excellent cook. But in the privacy of her small room in the kitchen building, Bessie read everything she could find. Newspapers used for wrapping, documents left carelessly in the main house, ledgers that recorded the business of the plantation. Over the years, Bessie Mee developed a complete understanding of how Riverside Manor operated. She knew which enslaved people had been purchased legally and which had been acquired through methods that violated even the loose laws of the time. She knew about Caldwell's practice of kidnapping free black people traveling through South Carolina and selling them into slavery. She knew about his financial debts, his gambling losses, his illegal smuggling operations. She kept all of this information stored in her remarkable memory, never writing anything down that could be discovered, waiting for an opportunity she had no reason to believe would ever come. And then James Caldwell, drunk and arrogant, stumbled into her kitchen on the night of August 15th and announced that she would become his wife. Bessie Mee was washing dishes when he entered. She did not turn around immediately, taking a moment to control her expression, to hide the racing thoughts flooding through her mind. When she finally turned to face him, her face showed nothing but polite confusion. Caldwell explained the bet, the money, the terms, speaking to her as if she were a child or a simple-minded person who could not possibly understand the complexities of what he was describing. But Bessie Mee understood everything immediately and completely. She understood that Caldwell saw her as a tool, a means to win money and prove his dominance over the other plantation owners. She understood that he expected her to be grateful, obedient, and temporary. She understood that in his arrogance, he had just handed her the opportunity she had been waiting for her entire life. And so Bessie Mee did something that shocked James Caldwell to his core. She looked him directly in the eyes, something enslaved people were never supposed to do, and asked one simple question: why? This single word, delivered with calm dignity rather than gratitude or fear, stopped Caldwell cold. He had expected tears or joy or immediate submission. Instead, this woman was questioning him, treating him as if he needed to justify himself to her. His first instinct was rage, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the alcohol dulling his reactions, or perhaps some part of him recognized that he needed her cooperation to win the bet. He explained again, more forcefully, that she should be grateful for the elevation in status, that she would become the wife of a wealthy plantation owner, that this was an opportunity beyond anything she could have imagined. Bessie Mee let him finish. Then she did something even more shocking. She negotiated. She told James Caldwell that if she was to be paraded as his wife for his entertainment and profit, if she was to be mocked and humiliated alongside him by all of South Carolina society, then she required certain conditions in return. She spoke clearly, confidently, and with none of the subservient manner that Caldwell expected. She said that she would agree to the marriage only if he granted her specific rights and privileges. First, she demanded her own bedroom with a door that locked from the inside. She would not share his bed or submit to him physically. Second, she demanded the continued right to manage the kitchen and the enslaved workers under her supervision without his interference. Third, and most importantly, she demanded the legal right to attend church every Sunday without restriction, to sit in the church building rather than outside, and to travel to church and back without an escort. She also demanded the right to have her own Bible and to keep it in her room. James Caldwell, too drunk and too proud to back down from the bet he had just accepted, and absolutely convinced that he could control this woman regardless of what he promised, agreed to everything. He saw her demands as childish and insignificant. A separate bedroom. Fine, he had no interest in her anyway. Control of the kitchen. She already had that. Church attendance. Let her waste her time with religion. He agreed to all of her terms, had his personal lawyer draw up a contract addendum outlining these conditions, and set the wedding date for 1 week later. What James Caldwell did not understand, what he could not possibly have understood given his lifetime of absolute privilege and arrogance, was that Bessie Mee had just secured the exact tools she needed to destroy him. A locked bedroom meant private space where she could read, write, and plan without observation. Control of the kitchen meant control over the information network that existed among enslaved workers across multiple plantations. Church attendance meant access to the one place where black people, enslaved and free, could gather and communicate. And a personal Bible meant she could hide documents inside it, the one book she could carry openly without suspicion. The wedding took place 1 week later on August 22nd, 1854, in the smallest and most private ceremony that could still be considered legal. No family members attended. No announcements were made in the Charleston newspapers. A judge who owed Caldwell money performed the ceremony in the library of Riverside Manor, with 2 overseers serving as witnesses. Bessie Mee wore a simple dress that she had sewn herself. James wore his finest suit, but looked miserable throughout the entire proceeding. The ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. The marriage certificate was signed, notarized, and filed with the county clerk. Bessie Mee Johnson legally became Bessie Mee Caldwell, the wife of one of the wealthiest men in South Carolina. The reaction from South Carolina society was immediate and explosive. Within days, news of the marriage had spread throughout the region. Some people laughed, assuming it was an elaborate joke that would be revealed as false. Others were outraged, seeing it as a violation of every social code that governed their world. The Caldwell family was horrified. James's mother took to her bed, claiming illness from the shame. His sisters refused to visit Riverside Manor or acknowledge Bessie's existence. The neighboring plantation owners who had made the bet were delighted, already composing cruel jokes and planning elaborate social events designed specifically to humiliate James and his new wife. But something unexpected began to happen. Bessie Mee refused to play the role that everyone expected of her. On the first Sunday after the marriage, she did not go to the separate outdoor area where enslaved people were allowed to listen to church services. Instead, wearing a clean but simple dress and carrying her Bible, she walked through the front door of the white church and sat in the very last pew. The congregation was stunned into silence. The minister stopped mid-sentence. Every head turned to stare at this black woman sitting calmly in their church. When several men approached to remove her forcibly, Bessie Mee pulled out the contract signed by James Caldwell, guaranteeing her right to attend church without restriction. She spoke clearly and calmly, reminding them that she was legally Mrs. James Caldwell, that she had her husband's written permission to be there, and that any attempt to remove her would constitute interference with a legal contract. The men, uncertain how to proceed and unwilling to create an even bigger scandal, retreated. Bessie Mee remained in that back pew for the entire service. She sang every hymn, followed every prayer, and left quietly when the service concluded. This became her pattern every single Sunday. Her presence in that church, sitting alone in the back but sitting nonetheless, was a constant visible reminder of the absurdity and hypocrisy of the entire system. She never spoke to the white congregation members, never attempted to sit further forward, never caused any disruption. But her mere presence disrupted everything. It forced every person in that church to confront the contradiction they preferred to ignore. If she was legally married to a white plantation owner, if she had the same last name as one of their most prominent families, then what did that mean for all their carefully constructed rules about racial hierarchy and separation? At Riverside Manor, Bessie Mee implemented the second part of her plan. As mistress of the house, she insisted on certain privileges that her marriage contract and social custom technically entitled her to, even if no one had expected her to claim them. She insisted on eating dinner at the main dining table. At first, James refused, eating alone in his study rather than sit at a table with her. But Bessie Mee was patient. When guests began to visit, curious to see the scandalous marriage for themselves, she would appear in the dining room dressed simply but appropriately and announce that dinner was served. When James tried to send her away, she would calmly remind him and his guests that she was his legal wife, that the marriage contract guaranteed her certain rights, and that sending her to eat in the kitchen would suggest that the marriage was not legitimate, which would void his bet and cost him $30,000. Trapped by his own greed and pride, James eventually conceded. Bessie Mee began taking her meals at the main table. The first few dinners were excruciating exercises in tense silence, but gradually something shifted. Bessie Mee was not subservient or apologetic. She did not grovel or seek approval. Instead, she conducted herself with quiet dignity, spoke when spoken to with intelligence and clarity, and demonstrated a knowledge of current events and social matters that shocked everyone who encountered her. Some of the guests, particularly women from northern families who had married into southern society, began to engage Bessie Mee in conversation, asking her opinions on everything from recipes to household management to religious matters. These conversations were carefully neutral and superficial, but they were conversations nonetheless, treating Bessie Mee as a person capable of thought and dialogue rather than property to be ignored. This drove James Caldwell absolutely mad. Every dinner became a battle of wills where he could not openly attack or demean his own wife, without appearing weak and cruel in front of his peers. But what none of these people knew, what James Caldwell could not possibly have suspected, was what Bessie Mee was doing in the privacy of her locked bedroom every night after these dinners concluded. She was writing. Using paper she had carefully collected over months, pencils she had hidden away, and the skills Margaret Davies had taught her years before, Bessie Mee began documenting everything. Every conversation she overheard, every business transaction discussed over dinner, every admission of illegal activity made by drunk plantation owners who assumed she was too ignorant to understand or too powerless to matter. She documented the complete financial operations of Riverside Manor. She recorded the names of every enslaved person on the plantation, their family relationships, where they had come from, how they had been acquired. She paid special attention to cases where she knew people had been illegally enslaved. In South Carolina in 1854, there were specific laws, often violated but still technically in force, about the enslavement of free black people. Bessie Mee knew of at least 15 people on Riverside Manor who had been free before being kidnapped and illegally sold into slavery by James Caldwell or his agents. She documented Caldwell's smuggling operations, his tax evasion, his practice of selling enslaved people across state lines in violation of various laws, his fraudulent insurance claims, and his numerous business dealings that involved forgery and false documentation. She recorded dates, names, amounts of money, and specific locations. Every night working by candlelight, Bessie Mee built a detailed archive of criminal activity that would destroy not just James Caldwell, but multiple prominent families across South Carolina. But Bessie Mee was not just documenting crimes. She was building a network. Through her position as head of the kitchen, she controlled the movement and communication of enslaved workers throughout Riverside Manor, and by extension, their connections to workers on neighboring plantations. Information flowed constantly between plantations through this invisible network. Bessie Mee began to carefully cultivate and expand these connections, always subtly, always carefully, never revealing the full scope of what she was doing. On Sundays at church, Bessie Mee made contact with free black people who attended services in a separate section. These brief encounters, a nod here, a whispered word there, gradually developed into something more. She learned that there were abolitionists operating secretly in South Carolina, that there was an underground railroad network that helped escaped slaves reach freedom in the North. She began to pass information through this network, not about escapes, but about the broader criminal activities of the plantation system. Meanwhile, James Caldwell was slowly losing his mind. The marriage that he had entered into as a cruel joke had become a nightmare that he could not escape without losing a fortune. His friends mocked him relentlessly. His family had essentially disowned him. His business partners treated him with barely concealed contempt. And worst of all, he could not control Bessie Mee. She was not defiant in ways he could punish. She followed the letter of their agreement perfectly. But she refused to be invisible, refused to be ashamed, refused to acknowledge that she was anything less than his legal wife with all the rights that entailed. His attempts to reassert control always backfired. When he tried to restrict her church attendance, she reminded him of the contract and threatened to take the matter to court, which would create an even bigger scandal. When he tried to prevent her from eating at the main table, she would simply wait until guests arrived and present herself, forcing him to either honor the agreement or admit publicly that the marriage was a sham and forfeit the bet. When he tried to intimidate her through anger and threats, she remained calm and unmoved, her eyes meeting his without fear. The months dragged on, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months. With each passing week, Bessie Mee's documentation grew more detailed and more damaging. She now had connections with abolitionists in Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston. She had identified sympathetic lawyers in the North who specialized in freedom cases. She had located several formerly enslaved people who had escaped to the North and would be willing to testify about Caldwell's activities if the opportunity arose. And then, as the 1-year mark approached, Bessie Mee made her final preparations. She created 3 complete copies of all her documentation, every piece of evidence, every recorded conversation, every detail of Caldwell's criminal empire. She sewed these documents into special pockets inside 3 different quilts, using techniques that would not be discovered by casual inspection. She made arrangements with trusted contacts to deliver these quilts to 3 specific destinations at precisely the right time. On the morning of August 22, 1855, exactly 1 year after the wedding, James Caldwell woke early with a sense of relief bordering on joy. The nightmare was finally over. He would collect his $30,000, dissolve the marriage through some legal mechanism, and begin to rebuild his reputation. He would send Bessie Mee back to the kitchen, or perhaps sell her to a plantation in Mississippi, far away where she could never embarrass him again. But when James went downstairs that morning, Bessie Mee was gone. Her room was empty, her few possessions vanished, and there was no sign of where she had gone. At first, James felt nothing but relief. She had run away, which meant she had violated the marriage contract, but he had still completed the full year, so technically he should still win the bet. He sent overseers to search the plantation grounds, more out of habit than any real desire to find her. But Bessie Mee had vanished completely. What James Caldwell did not know was that, at that exact moment, three separate packages were being delivered to three separate destinations. The first package arrived at the offices of The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper published in Boston by William Lloyd Garrison. Inside the quilt was the complete documentation of James Caldwell's illegal enslavement of free black people, including names, dates, and locations. The second package arrived at the office of a federal marshal in Charleston, who was one of the few officials in South Carolina who took seriously the federal laws against the international slave trade and the kidnapping of free citizens. Inside this quilt was evidence of Caldwell's smuggling operations and his systematic kidnapping and sale of free black people. The third package arrived at the law office of Samuel Wright, a Philadelphia lawyer who specialized in freedom suits and had connections throughout the abolitionist movement. Inside this quilt was everything: the personal stories of illegally enslaved people, the financial records proving Caldwell's fraud, and most importantly, copies of the marriage certificate and contract that proved Bessie Mee Caldwell was legally the wife of James Caldwell, and therefore entitled to bring legal action on behalf of herself and others. Within a week, the scandal exploded across the South and the North. The Liberator published a detailed article about James Caldwell's illegal activities, naming names and providing specific evidence. The federal marshal in Charleston began an official investigation into the illegal enslavement of free citizens. Most devastatingly, Samuel Wright filed multiple legal actions in federal court, including freedom suits on behalf of 15 people illegally held at Riverside Manor, a civil suit demanding monetary damages for the illegal enslavement and abuse of his client Bessie Mee Caldwell, and a criminal complaint alleging fraud, kidnapping, and human trafficking. The legal firestorm that followed consumed not just James Caldwell, but dozens of prominent South Carolina families. The evidence Bessie Mee had gathered implicated plantation owners, slave traders, judges, lawyers, and government officials in a systematic network of illegal activity. Some of it involved violations of federal law that even Southern courts could not ignore. Some of it involved financial fraud that threatened the business interests of powerful men who quickly turned against Caldwell to protect themselves. James Caldwell was arrested in September of 1855 on federal charges of kidnapping free citizens and selling them into slavery. His plantation was seized as part of the federal investigation. Over the next 6 months, as investigators went through Riverside Manor's records and compared them to Bessie Mee's documentation, they discovered even more criminal activity than she had been able to document. Caldwell had been systematically falsifying documents for years, claiming that free black people were escaped slaves in order to sell them. He had forged court orders and bills of sale. He had bribed officials and intimidated witnesses. The trials that followed were sensational and devastating. Bessie Mee's documentation proved critical in multiple cases. 15 people were freed from Riverside Manor and granted legal recognition as free citizens who had been illegally enslaved. Several other plantation owners were arrested and charged with similar crimes. 2 judges were removed from office for accepting bribes to falsify freedom papers. The scandal reached all the way to the South Carolina state legislature, where several officials were implicated in the conspiracy. James Caldwell never collected his $30,000. The plantation owners who had made the bet claimed that since Bessie Mee had disappeared, the marriage had been dissolved, and therefore Caldwell had not fulfilled the terms. Caldwell, facing criminal charges and financial ruin, was in no position to argue. Riverside Manor was sold at auction to pay legal fees and restitution to the people he had illegally enslaved. The Caldwell family fortune was completely destroyed. In 1858, 3 years after the scandal began, James Caldwell died in prison. The official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but those who knew him said he had simply given up, broken by the complete destruction of everything he had believed made him superior and untouchable. His death went largely unnoticed. The family that had once been among the most powerful in South Carolina had been completely destroyed, their name now associated with scandal, criminality, and disgrace. But what of Bessie Mee? Despite intensive searches and investigations, she was never found. There were reports and rumors over the years. Some claimed to have seen her in Canada, living under a new name and working with the abolitionist movement. Others said she remained in the South, using her intelligence and strategic skills to help others escape slavery through the Underground Railroad. A few claimed she had traveled to Europe, where she lived freely and openly, her remarkable story known only to a small circle of trusted friends. The truth is that no one knows for certain what happened to Bessie Mee Caldwell after she disappeared on that August morning in 1855. What we do know is that her legacy lived on in ways both visible and invisible. The 15 people freed as a direct result of her actions went on to build lives of freedom, some remaining in the South, others traveling north. Several of them became active in the abolitionist movement, speaking publicly about their experiences and the injustice of slavery. The legal precedents established by the cases built on Bessie Mee's documentation were used in other freedom suits across the South. Her methods of documentation and evidence gathering became a model for abolitionists and lawyers fighting against slavery. The scandal she exposed helped fuel the growing national conflict over slavery that would eventually lead to the Civil War. But perhaps most importantly, Bessie Mee's story became a powerful symbol within the enslaved community and among abolitionists of black intelligence, capability, and resistance. Here was a woman who had been dismissed as nothing more than a cook, who had been mocked for her appearance, who had been used as the punchline of a cruel joke by powerful men who thought themselves untouchable. And this woman had systematically documented their crimes, built a legal case that destroyed them, and escaped to freedom, all while operating under their noses and using their own arrogance against them. The story spread through the Underground Railroad network, through abolitionist publications, through the whispered conversations of enslaved people across the South. Details were added and embellished over time. Some versions of the story turned Bessie Mee into a nearly mythical figure of resistance and revenge. But at the core of every version was a fundamental truth that could not be denied. Bessie Mee had won. She had taken the cruelest joke that powerful men could devise and turned it into a weapon that destroyed them completely. Years later, after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, a journalist tracking down stories of resistance and escape found an elderly black woman in Toronto who claimed to have known Bessie Mee. The woman would not give her own name and would not confirm whether she was Bessie Mee herself or simply a friend. But she told the journalist something that he never forgot. She said that what people needed to understand about Bessie Mee was not just that she was intelligent or strategic or brave, though she was all of those things. What people needed to understand was that Bessie Mee had never once, not for a single moment, believed what they said about her. She had never internalized their cruelty or accepted their definitions of her worth. She had always known exactly who she was, what she was capable of, and what she deserved. And when the opportunity came, she had been ready. This is the story of how a drunken bet between wealthy plantation owners in 1854 set in motion events that destroyed some of the most powerful men in the South, freed people from illegal enslavement, exposed systemic corruption, and proved that intelligence, courage, and strategic brilliance could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances. This is the story of how arrogance and cruelty created the conditions for their own destruction. This is the story of Bessie Mee Caldwell, a woman who turned mockery into justice and disappeared into freedom, leaving behind only the ruins of her enemies and the inspiration of her example. The South was shocked not because a plantation owner married his cook in a bet, but because that cook proved to be smarter, stronger, and more strategic than every powerful man who underestimated her. And that is a lesson that echoes through history long after the names of those powerful men have been forgotten. As the years passed after Bessie Mee's disappearance, the reverberations of what she had accomplished continued to spread throughout the South and beyond. The case became known among legal scholars and abolitionists as the Caldwell exposure, and it fundamentally changed how many people thought about the intelligence and capability of enslaved people. But there was so much more to this story than what appeared in the newspapers or legal documents. There were layers of planning, moments of incredible risk, and a network of people who helped make Bessie Mee's victory possible, most of whose names were never recorded in history. To truly understand the full scope of what Bessie Mee accomplished, we need to go back further and examine how she prepared for an opportunity she had no guarantee would ever come. From the moment Margaret Davies began teaching her to read in secret, Bessie Mee understood that knowledge was power, but also that knowledge alone was not enough. She needed to understand the system completely, to know its weaknesses, and to be ready to exploit those weaknesses if the chance ever arose. In the kitchen at Riverside Manor, Bessie Mee was in a unique position to observe and gather information. Enslaved people who worked in the house, particularly in the kitchen, saw and heard things that field workers never encountered. They overheard conversations between white family members and their guests. They saw documents left carelessly on tables. They learned the routines, habits, and secrets of the people who claimed to own them. But most white enslavers never truly considered that the people serving their meals might be listening, understanding, and remembering every word. Bessie Mee developed a meticulous system of observation and memory. When she overheard important conversations, she would wait until late at night in her small room and then rehearse everything she had heard, word for word, committing it perfectly to memory. She created mental categories for different types of information: financial dealings, illegal activities, family conflicts, political discussions. Over the years, she built a comprehensive mental archive of the Caldwell family's business and personal affairs. But information alone was not enough. Bessie Mee also cultivated relationships and networks that would prove crucial when the time came to act. In the enslaved community at Riverside Manor, she held a position of significant influence. As head cook, she supervised several other enslaved people in the kitchen, and she used this position to create a culture of mutual protection and subtle resistance. She made sure that the people working under her supervision were well fed from kitchen surplus, that they had small comforts when possible, and that they knew she would protect them from punishment when she could. This created loyalty, but more importantly, it created trust. The people who worked with Bessie Mee knew that she was different, that she possessed unusual knowledge and capability, though they did not know the full extent of it. They protected her secrets without even knowing what those secrets were. When Bessie needed information from other parts of the plantation or from neighboring plantations, she could ask questions that were then passed through the invisible network of communication that existed among enslaved people across the region. This network was one of the most remarkable and least documented aspects of resistance to slavery. Despite systematic efforts to prevent communication and organization, enslaved people developed sophisticated methods of passing information. Messages were embedded in songs, in the patterns of quilts hung out to dry, in seemingly casual conversations. Information traveled between plantations when enslaved people were sent on errands, when they gathered for the rare communal events, or through the network of people who worked on multiple properties. Bessie Mee understood this network and became one of its most effective operators. She learned which enslaved people on neighboring plantations could be trusted with sensitive information. She learned the schedules of traveling slave traders and preachers who moved between plantations and could carry messages. She learned which free black people in Charleston and the surrounding areas were secretly working with abolitionists. And she carefully cultivated these connections over years, never revealing the full scope of what she was building, always maintaining the appearance of being nothing more than an excellent cook who occasionally asked innocent questions. When James Caldwell stumbled into her kitchen that night in August 1854 and announced that she would become his wife, Bessie Mee had been preparing for 15 years for an opportunity that she had no reason to believe would ever come. The bet was insane, unprecedented, and completely unexpected. But Bessie Mee recognized it immediately for what it was: a crack in the system, an opening created by the arrogance and cruelty of men who thought themselves untouchable. The negotiation she conducted with Caldwell that night was not spontaneous. Every demand she made had been thought through years earlier as part of her mental preparation for any possible opportunity. A locked private room meant space to work without observation. Control of the kitchen meant maintaining her information network. Church attendance meant access to the broader black community, both enslaved and free. These were not random requests. They were the precise tools she needed to do what she had been planning for years. The week between the bet and the wedding was a flurry of careful preparation disguised as ordinary activity. Bessie Mee began positioning certain trusted people in key roles within the household. She made sure that the enslaved woman who cleaned the main house was someone who would observe carefully and report back. She ensured that the man who drove the carriage to church was someone who could be trusted to make brief stops and pass messages without being questioned. She arranged for kitchen supplies to be ordered from specific merchants in Charleston who were known to have abolitionist sympathies. All of this was done carefully, subtly, in ways that appeared completely ordinary to anyone observing. James Caldwell and his overseers saw nothing unusual, just the normal operations of a well-run kitchen preparing for a slight change in household arrangements. They could not possibly have understood that Bessie Mee was actually assembling the infrastructure for an intelligence operation that would eventually destroy them. The wedding itself was brief and uncomfortable, but it accomplished something that Bessie Mee had carefully calculated. It created a legal document that gave her standing she had never possessed before. As an enslaved woman, Bessie Mee had no legal rights, no standing in court, no ability to enter into contracts or make legal claims. But as the legal wife of James Caldwell, even in a marriage that everyone knew was a mockery, she had suddenly acquired legal personhood in ways that would prove crucial later. The marriage certificate was a real legal document, properly filed with the county clerk. The contract addendum outlining her rights and privileges was also legally binding. Bessie Mee understood something that James Caldwell, in his arrogance and drunkenness, had completely failed to consider. These documents gave her legal leverage that no enslaved person normally possessed. They gave her the ability to make legal claims, to file court actions, to demand rights that could not simply be dismissed as the complaints of property with no legal standing. The first few months of the marriage were a careful dance of establishing precedents and boundaries. Every time Bessie Mee attended church, she was establishing that she had the right to do so. Every time she sat at the dining table, she was establishing her position as the legal wife of the household. Every time James Caldwell tried to restrict her, and she successfully pushed back by referencing the contract, she was establishing that their agreement was legally enforceable. She was building a record of behavior and expectations that would make it harder for Caldwell to later claim the marriage had been a sham or that she had violated its terms. But while everyone was focused on the visible spectacle of Bessie Mee attending white church services and eating at the master's table, The real work was happening in the shadows. In her locked bedroom each night, Bessie Mee was conducting the most important work of her life. She had carefully collected paper over the preceding months, taking sheets from the plantation office a few at a time in quantities small enough not to be noticed. She had acquired pencils by trading kitchen goods to merchants. She had created a hidden workspace inside a trunk that appeared to contain nothing but old quilts and linens. Every night, by candlelight, Bessie Mee wrote. She documented everything she had observed over the past 15 years, every conversation overheard, every illegal transaction discussed, every piece of evidence of criminal activity. But she did not just write random observations. Bessie Mee organized her documentation like a lawyer building a legal case, because she understood that evidence needed to be presented in a way that would be compelling and credible to Northern courts and abolitionist lawyers. She created detailed records for each illegally enslaved person at Riverside Manor. For a man named Samuel who had been kidnapped from Pennsylvania in 1847, she documented the date of his arrival, the false papers that had been created claiming he was an escaped slave, the names of the people involved in his kidnapping, and the specific legal violations this represented. For a woman named Clara who had been born free in Delaware and kidnapped in 1850, Bessie Mee created an equally detailed record, including testimony from other enslaved people who had heard Clara's story and could serve as witnesses. For each person, Bessie Mee tried to gather as much identifying information as possible that might help locate their original families or communities. She recorded birthplaces, family names, physical descriptions, skills, and occupations. She understood that for freedom suits to succeed, it would be necessary to prove not just that these people had been illegally enslaved, but who they had been before their freedom was stolen. Beyond the cases of individual people, Bessie Mee documented the broader criminal enterprise that James Caldwell operated. She recorded his smuggling activities, noting specific dates when ships arrived at night carrying enslaved people who had been illegally imported from Africa or the Caribbean, in violation of federal law banning the international slave trade. She documented his tax evasion schemes, his fraudulent insurance claims, his practice of selling enslaved people across state lines with forged documentation. What made Bessie Mee's documentation particularly powerful was her attention to detail and corroboration. She did not just make claims, she provided specific dates, names, amounts of money, and locations. When possible, she noted which other people had witnessed particular events or conversations. She created a web of evidence where individual pieces might be disputed, but the overall pattern was overwhelming and undeniable. As Bessie Mee worked on this documentation night after night, she also continued to expand her network of contacts outside Riverside Manor. Her Sunday church attendance was crucial for this. Although she sat separately from the white congregation, there was a section where free black people attended services. These were skilled tradespeople, small business owners, and descendants of people who had been freed generations earlier. They occupied a precarious position in South Carolina society, always under suspicion and always at risk of being kidnapped and enslaved themselves if they could not prove their free status. Bessie Mee began to make contact with several of these free black church members through carefully orchestrated brief encounters. A dropped Bible that someone helped her retrieve, with a whispered thank you and a meaningful look. A quiet conversation outside the church building while waiting for the carriage. These small moments of connection gradually developed into something more substantial. Several free black people in Charleston were secretly working with the abolitionist movement, passing information north and helping escaped slaves reach freedom. One of Bessie Mee's most important contacts was a free black woman named Ruth Patterson, who ran a small bakery in Charleston and was secretly part of the Underground Railroad network. Ruth had connections to abolitionists in Philadelphia and Boston, and she had developed methods of smuggling messages and occasionally people out of South Carolina hidden among legitimate cargo. Over several months of careful Sunday conversations, Bessie Mee and Ruth developed a relationship built on mutual trust and shared purpose. Through Ruth, Bessie Mee learned about Samuel Wright, the Philadelphia lawyer who specialized in freedom suits. She learned about the Liberator newspaper and its editor William Lloyd Garrison, who was constantly seeking evidence of illegal enslavement and other crimes associated with slavery. She learned about the specific federal laws that Caldwell was violating and how to document violations in ways that would be most useful for legal prosecution. This information was crucial because it allowed Bessie Mee to shape her documentation to be maximally effective for the purposes it would eventually serve. She learned which specific details were most important for freedom suits, which evidence would be most compelling for criminal prosecutions, and which stories would be most powerful for publication in abolitionist newspapers to sway public opinion. But gathering information and building networks was only part of Bessie Mee's preparation. She also had to plan her escape and the delivery of her documentation in ways that would maximize impact while keeping her safe. This was perhaps the most complex part of her entire plan, because it required perfect timing and coordination across multiple people and locations. Bessie Mee decided early on that she would not attempt to escape before the one-year anniversary of the marriage. There were several reasons for this decision. First, completing the full year would make it impossible for Caldwell to claim she had violated the marriage contract, protecting her legal standing for the lawsuits that would follow. Second, the longer she remained at Riverside Manor, the more information she could gather, and the more comprehensive her documentation would become. Third, a longer time period allowed her to more carefully prepare her escape route and arrange for the delivery of her evidence to multiple destinations simultaneously. The plan Bessie Mee developed was remarkably sophisticated. She would create 3 complete copies of all her documentation, which represented hundreds of hours of writing and organizing. Each copy would be sewn into a specially prepared quilt, using a technique that would not be immediately obvious to anyone examining the quilt casually. The quilts would be delivered to 3 different destinations on the same day that Bessie Mee disappeared, ensuring that even if 1 or 2 copies were intercepted, at least one would reach its intended target. The quilts themselves were works of art and engineering. Bessie Mee worked on them over several months, using fabric scraps and materials that were readily available in the plantation household. To anyone observing, she was simply making quilts during her limited free time, a common enough activity for enslaved women. But the construction of these quilts was designed with a specific purpose. Each quilt had special pockets sewn into its interior layers where documents could be hidden. The pockets were constructed in ways that distributed the papers evenly throughout the quilt, so that it would not feel unusually stiff or heavy in any one area. Bessie Mee also encoded additional information into the quilt patterns themselves, using traditional quilt patterns that had specific meanings within the enslaved community. These patterns would not mean anything to white people who might examine the quilts, but they contained messages for the abolitionists who would receive them about the nature and importance of what was hidden inside. The delivery of the quilts required coordination with multiple people across multiple locations. Ruth Patterson would handle the delivery to Philadelphia, using her connections with merchants who regularly transported goods between Charleston and northern cities. A free black minister who traveled between South Carolina and Massachusetts would carry the second quilt to Boston. The third quilt would be delivered to the federal marshal in Charleston through a more direct but riskier route, involving a sympathetic white merchant who had secret abolitionist leanings. All of this had to be coordinated, so that the deliveries happened on the same day that Bessie Mee disappeared, creating maximum impact and making it difficult for Caldwell or his allies to intercept the evidence or retaliate before it became public. The timing was crucial and required messages to be passed through the network weeks in advance, with backup plans in case anything went wrong. As the one-year anniversary approached, Bessie Mee began making final preparations. She had to decide what to take with her and what to leave behind. She could not carry much without arousing suspicion, so she had to carefully select only the most essential items. She prepared a small bundle of clothes, a little money that she had carefully saved from small gifts and payments over the years, and her Bible, which contained additional notes and contacts written in code on its pages. But there was something else Bessie Mee had to do before she left, something that went beyond her personal escape or even the legal case she was building against Caldwell. She had to find ways to help the people she was leaving behind, particularly those she had worked with closely in the kitchen and household. She could not take them with her without making escape impossible for everyone, but she could leave behind information and resources that might help them. In the weeks before her planned disappearance, Bessie Mee had quiet conversations with several trusted individuals. She told them, without revealing her full plan, that changes were coming and that they needed to be prepared. She gave them information about how to contact Ruth Patterson and other free black allies in Charleston, if they ever had the opportunity. She taught them, as much as she could in brief moments, about the laws regarding illegal enslavement and how to recognize if they or someone they knew might have been free before being kidnapped. Most importantly, Bessie Mee made sure that key people knew the names and details of the 15 individuals who had been illegally enslaved at Riverside Manor. She knew that when the legal cases began, these people would need witnesses who could testify about their stories and their true identities. By spreading this information among several trusted people, she ensured that the knowledge would survive even if individual witnesses were sold away or silenced. The night before her planned disappearance, Bessie Mee barely slept. She lay in her locked room, thinking about everything she was leaving behind and everything she was about to risk. There was no guarantee her plan would work. The quilts might be intercepted. The legal cases might be dismissed by Southern courts that had no interest in justice for black people. She might be captured during her escape and subjected to brutal punishment. But Bessie Mee had long ago made peace with these risks. She had decided years earlier that she would rather die fighting for freedom and justice than live another day accepting the degradation of slavery. On the morning of August 22, 1855, Bessie Mee rose before dawn. She dressed carefully in the clothes she had prepared for travel, sturdy and practical but not so unusual as to draw attention. She took her small bundle and her Bible. She looked around the small room that had been hers for the past year, the room where she had written and planned and built the case that would destroy James Caldwell. Then she walked out of Riverside Manor for the last time. Her escape had been carefully choreographed with the help of Ruth Patterson and others in the network. A carriage was waiting at a prearranged location just beyond the plantation boundaries, driven by a free black man who asked no questions and knew only that he was to take Bessie Mee to Charleston. From Charleston, she would travel by ship to Philadelphia, hidden among cargo in a method that the Underground Railroad network had perfected over years of helping people escape. The ship voyage was dangerous and terrifying. Bessie Mee spent most of the journey hidden in a specially constructed compartment below deck, in darkness, barely able to move, with limited air and no idea if the ship might be stopped and searched. She had only a small amount of food and water. The journey took 5 days that felt like an eternity, but when the ship finally docked in Philadelphia and Bessie Mee emerged from her hiding place into the cool northern air, she experienced freedom for the first time in her life. Ruth Patterson's contacts in Philadelphia were waiting for her. They took Bessie Mee to a safe house run by the abolitionist community, where she was given food, clean clothes, and a place to rest. But Bessie Mee rested for only one day before she insisted on meeting with Samuel Wright, the lawyer. She wanted to make sure that her documentation had arrived safely and that the legal cases would proceed as planned. All three quilts had successfully reached their destinations. Samuel Wright had already begun examining Bessie Mee's documentation and was astounded by its comprehensiveness and detail. He told her that in his 20 years of working on freedom suits, he had never seen evidence this thorough or well-organized. The Liberator had received its copy and was preparing a major exposé. The federal marshal in Charleston had opened an official investigation based on the evidence he received. But Samuel Wright also told Bessie Mee something that made her pause. He explained that while her documentation was powerful, the legal cases would be even stronger if she was willing to testify personally. Her status as Caldwell's legal wife gave her unique standing in court. Her first-hand testimony would be incredibly powerful. But testifying would mean revealing where she was, making her visible and vulnerable, and potentially allowing Caldwell or his allies to attempt to force her to return to South Carolina. Bessie Mee considered this carefully. She had not initially planned to testify personally, preferring to disappear completely and let the documentation speak for itself. But she understood Samuel Wright's point. Her presence and testimony could make the difference between legal cases that might be dismissed and cases that would lead to actual freedom for the people she was fighting for. After 2 days of thought and prayer, Bessie Mee made her decision. She would testify, but only in northern courts where she had some protection, and only with security arrangements in place. This decision showed Bessie Mee's remarkable courage and her absolute commitment to justice over personal safety. She knew that making herself visible would put her at risk. She knew that Caldwell and his allies would attempt to intimidate her, discredit her, and possibly even kidnap her and force her back to South Carolina. But she also knew that the 15 people illegally enslaved at Riverside Manor deserved every possible chance at freedom, and if her testimony could provide that chance, she was willing to take the risk. The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything the American legal system had seen before. Samuel Wright filed multiple lawsuits simultaneously in federal court, each one representing a different illegally enslaved person from Riverside Manor. He also filed a civil suit on behalf of Bessie Mee herself, demanding damages for the years she had been illegally held in slavery. The cases relied heavily on Bessie Mee's documentation, but also on her personal testimony. The first time Bessie Mee testified in court was in October of 1855, in a federal courthouse in Philadelphia. The courtroom was packed with abolitionists, journalists, curious observers, and hostile Southern sympathizers who had traveled north to try to intimidate her. Bessie Mee walked to the witness stand with her head held high, wearing a simple but dignified dress that had been provided by Philadelphia's black community. When asked to swear the oath, she placed her hand on the Bible and spoke clearly and firmly. For 3 days, Bessie Mee testified. She described the operations of Riverside Manor in meticulous detail. She explained how she had documented James Caldwell's crimes over the course of 15 years. She told the stories of each illegally enslaved person, providing names, dates, and circumstances. She answered questions from lawyers with precision and clarity, never wavering, never backing down, even when hostile attorneys tried to discredit her or trick her into contradictions. The testimony was devastating. Newspapers across the North covered it extensively, printing long excerpts of what Bessie Mee said. Abolitionists seized on her story as proof of the intelligence and humanity of black people and the fundamental injustice of slavery. The documentation she had created, combined with her powerful testimony, made it impossible for even Northern judges sympathetic to Southern interests to dismiss the cases. One by one, the freedom suits succeeded. Samuel, the man who had been kidnapped from Pennsylvania in 1847, was declared legally free and awarded damages. Clara, kidnapped from Delaware, was freed and reunited with family members who had been searching for her for years. All 15 of the illegally enslaved people from Riverside Manor were eventually freed through legal proceedings that relied on Bessie Mee's evidence and testimony. But the legal victories went beyond individual freedom suits. The federal marshal's investigation led to criminal charges against James Caldwell and several of his business associates for kidnapping, human trafficking, and smuggling. The evidence was so overwhelming that even in South Carolina, where courts were normally hostile to any challenges to slavery, prosecutors had no choice but to pursue the cases. Too many prominent people were implicated, too much illegal activity exposed, for the system to simply ignore it. The trials in South Carolina were spectacles of corruption and resistance. Prosecutors tried to build cases while being undermined by judges and officials who wanted to protect the plantation system. Defense attorneys attempted every possible strategy to discredit Bessie Mee and dismiss the evidence. But the documentation she had created was too detailed, too comprehensive, and too well corroborated to be dismissed. Even hostile judges could not simply ignore federal laws that had been clearly violated. James Caldwell's conviction in 1856 sent shockwaves through South Carolina society. It was almost unprecedented for a wealthy white plantation owner to be convicted of crimes related to slavery, especially based largely on evidence gathered and presented by a black woman. The sentence was relatively light by modern standards, just 10 years in prison, but it represented a complete destruction of Caldwell's life, reputation, and fortune. The broader impact on South Carolina society was profound. The scandal exposed a network of illegal activity that implicated dozens of prominent families. Several other plantation owners were arrested and charged with similar crimes. 2 judges were removed from office. The political fallout reached the state legislature and influenced elections. For a brief period, there was genuine fear among plantation owners that the system they had built might actually face legal accountability. But the impact went far beyond legal cases and political consequences. The story of Bessie Mee Caldwell became a powerful narrative in the abolitionist movement. Frederick Douglass wrote about her in his newspaper. Harriet Beecher Stowe mentioned her in speeches and writings. Sojourner Truth spoke about Bessie Mee as an example of black women's strength and intelligence. The story was told and retold, adapted and embellished, used to counter racist arguments about black people's intellectual inferiority and to demonstrate the moral bankruptcy of slavery. Within the enslaved community, Bessie Mee's story spread through the invisible networks of communication and became a source of hope and inspiration. Here was proof that the system could be beaten, that intelligence and planning could overcome even the most oppressive circumstances, that patience and preparation could lead to victory against seemingly impossible odds. The story gave people hope, and hope was a form of resistance in itself. But what happened to Bessie Mee after the trials? This remains one of the great mysteries of her story. After her final court appearance in early 1857, Bessie Mee once again disappeared from public view. There are various accounts and rumors about what became of her, but no definitive evidence. Some records suggest that she traveled to Canada, which had become a destination for many escaped slaves due to British laws that refused to return fugitive slaves to the United States. In Canada, she would have been truly free and safe from any attempts by Southern interests to recapture her. There are unconfirmed reports of a black woman matching her description living in Toronto in the 1860s, working as a teacher, and involved in helping other formerly enslaved people adjust to freedom. Other accounts suggest Bessie Mee may have traveled to England or France, where abolitionist sympathizers sometimes helped formerly enslaved people establish new lives. Some European abolitionists were fascinated by American slavery and eager to support people who had escaped it. Bessie Mee's remarkable story would have made her welcome in these circles, and her intelligence and education would have allowed her to thrive in such environments. There are also persistent rumors that Bessie Mee returned to the South, using a new identity to continue helping enslaved people through the Underground Railroad. This would have been incredibly dangerous, but it would be consistent with the courage and commitment to justice that she had already demonstrated. Some historians have suggested that several Underground Railroad conductors who operated in the late 1850s using code names might have been Bessie Mee operating under aliases. The truth is that we simply do not know with certainty what happened to Bessie Mee Caldwell after 1857. What we do know is that she successfully escaped slavery, destroyed the man who claimed to own her, freed 15 people from illegal enslavement, exposed systematic criminal activity, and inspired countless others through her example. Whether she lived out her days in quiet freedom in Canada, or continued her fight for justice under a new identity, or built a new life entirely separate from the struggles that had defined her years in slavery, she earned the right to choose her own path. What we can say with certainty is that Bessie Mee Caldwell represents one of the most remarkable examples of resistance, intelligence, and strategic brilliance in the history of American slavery. Her story demonstrates that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents who resisted their oppression in sophisticated and effective ways when opportunities arose. Her documentation and testimony provided concrete evidence that destroyed the myth of enslaved people's intellectual inferiority and exposed the criminal nature of slavery itself. The legacy of Bessie Mee's actions extended far beyond the immediate legal victories and individual freedoms she achieved. The precedents established by the cases built on her evidence were cited in other freedom suits throughout the late 1850s. Her methods of documentation became a model for abolitionists and lawyers. The scandal she exposed contributed to the growing national conflict over slavery that would eventually lead to the Civil War. When we remember Bessie Mee Caldwell today, we should remember not just the dramatic story of how a drunken bet led to the exposure of criminal activity and the destruction of a wealthy family. We should remember a woman who spent 15 years preparing for an opportunity she had no guarantee would come. We should remember someone who transformed herself from an enslaved cook into a legal strategist, a documenter of crimes, a builder of networks, and ultimately a destroyer of the system that tried to enslave her. We should remember that when James Caldwell stumbled drunkenly into her kitchen that night in August 1854, Bessie Mee did not react with gratitude or fear or submission. She recognized an opportunity, and she seized it with both hands. She negotiated for the exact tools she needed. She executed a plan that she had been developing for years with patience, precision, and absolute strategic clarity. And when the time came to act, she acted decisively and completely. The story of Bessie Mee Caldwell is a reminder that oppressed people are never powerless, even when the systems arrayed against them seem overwhelming. It is a reminder that intelligence, courage, and careful planning can create opportunities for justice, even in the most unjust circumstances. It is a reminder that the cruelty and arrogance of oppressors often create the very conditions that lead to their downfall. Most importantly, the story of Bessie Mee Caldwell is a reminder that history is full of remarkable people whose stories have been forgotten or erased, people who fought for freedom and justice in ways both dramatic and quiet, people whose courage and brilliance deserve to be remembered and celebrated. Bessie Mee used the tools available to her, the intelligence she had cultivated, and the network she had carefully built to achieve what seemed impossible. She turned a cruel joke into an opportunity for justice. She transformed mockery into victory. And in doing so, she changed history in ways that continue to resonate today. This is the complete story of the plantation owner who married his cook slave as a bet, and what happened truly did shock the South. But it shocked the South not because of the scandal of the marriage itself, but because it exposed the fundamental lie that slavery was built upon. The lie that black people were inferior, incapable, and deserving of their enslavement. Bessie Mee Caldwell proved that lie false through her actions. She demonstrated intelligence that exceeded that of the men who claimed to own her. She executed a strategy that destroyed their power, and she escaped into freedom, leaving behind only the ruins of her enemies and the liberation of those she fought for. In the end, James Caldwell lost everything: his freedom, his fortune, his reputation, and ultimately his life. The men who made that drunken bet saw their social circles destroyed by scandal. The system they believed in was exposed as fundamentally criminal and unjust. And Bessie Mee Caldwell, the woman they had mocked and used as the subject of their cruel joke, emerged victorious in every way that mattered. She won her freedom. She achieved justice for others. She proved her humanity and capability beyond any doubt. And she disappeared into a life of her own choosing, having accomplished something that seemed impossible when she was first brought to Riverside Manor as a 15-year-old girl sold at auction. This is what happened when arrogance met intelligence, when cruelty created opportunity, and when a remarkable woman seized the chance to change her life and the lives of others. This is the story that shocked the South and inspired the North. This is the story of Bessie Mee Caldwell, and it deserves to be remembered and told for as long as people seek examples of courage, intelligence, and the indomitable human spirit triumphing over oppression. The story continues to resonate today because it speaks to fundamental truths about justice, resistance, and the power of one person to make a difference against impossible odds. Bessie Mee Caldwell made that difference, and in doing so, she secured her place in history as one of the most remarkable figures of resistance in the entire story of American slavery.